Thank you for watching this online class presentation from Cedarville University. Cedarville students live by the core values of love for God, love for others, integrity in conduct, and excellence in effort. These core values shape each student's experience at Cedarville and embody how we relate to one another. We invite you to learn more at cedarville.edu.
So let's take a look at the second half of Judges and Ruth. And if you did the reading for today, you realize how incredibly ugly and disgusting this is. Now, the good news is there's light at the end of the tunnel. The bad news is it's going to get darker before it gets light. Right? So let's review just a little bit. Very first lesson I want you to know is the ones right up here on the screen now. That is, the Judges and Ruth absolutely have to fit together. They are a two-part masterpiece about redemption. So you never want to just get to the end of the Judges and say, okay, what's the big idea or what is the blessing you get there? Because you don't really get much unless you compare it with Ruth. So we will certainly do that. One of the other big ideas, of course, was the ups and downs, the big cycle of sin, oppression, distress, and deliverance. But the way we nuanced it was, in fact, because they turned to ways even more corrupt, you have to actually think of this as not simply this two-dimensional cycle, but actually a downward spiral. So every one of these judges we follow, things you should expect them to get worse and worse and worse and worse. And we often try to deny that and make heroes out of some of these judges, and we do that to our own detriment and to the poor interpretation of the book. And ultimately it hurts us because we don't see the majesty of God's solution. So without giving away the whole story there, I'll just leave it at that. We took a look at Ehud and the left-handed loan deliverer that he was. We saw Barak and Jael and their deadly nails and all those different aspects of it. And I think we actually kind of finished with this story about Gideon, that he knew that the Lord, not Baal, was God, and he knew that the Lord, not Gideon, was king. But the problem, of course, is this. At the end of his life, he makes an idol for the people to worship Baal with, and then he also starts to act like a king as he has a harem and 140 kids. So even though he kind of gets it right on the outside, you can see these inner tendencies that show up in generations which come later. So that leads us then to the next deliverer, the impulsive one, this guy named Jephthah. Again, I trust that you've read the material, so I'm just going to summarize the high points, hit the high points. And we all know the story about him making this rash vow. I hope it's right there on the screen. Jephthah made a vow to the Lord, if you give me the Ammonites into my hands, whatever comes out of the door of my house to meet me when I return will be the Lord's, and I will sacrifice as a burnt offering. Now, anything, given these situations in the Middle East, anything could have come out of his house, right? It could have been an animal, but in fact, there's a good possibility it's going to be a human. And so what he actually is doing here is toying with Baal worship. He's saying, God, do you want human sacrifice? And of course, if he just reads Deuteronomy, he knows God hates that stuff, but he just isn't sure exactly who God is. And so he makes this rash kind of a vow. And the text says in verse 39, he did to her as he had vowed. Now, an awful lot of people want to say, well, what he did was, he didn't actually sacrifice her. That'd be gross. God doesn't like that. But what he did do was he made her he sent her to a convent, and so she never got married, so he sacrificed her figuratively. The trouble with that is you don't realize that we're in a spiral that's really going down, right? And the text says clearly, he did to her as he had vowed, and what he vowed was sacrifice her as a burnt offering. So he really killed his own daughter? Yep, that's what he did. But doesn't God hate that? Yes. God hates that and 1,000 other things in this book too. But this is what people choose. God totally hates that. So how does it make you feel? How is the progress here? So the progress is this. Now all of a sudden, we're getting to a point where our leaders don't even know who God is. I don't mean that he doesn't act in faith. Sometimes he does. But he just has this really messed up vision. God, do you want human sacrifice? Of course not. I don't want that, right? What about the women? How are they treated? Well, now it turns out that they're killed by those who, of all people, should be protecting them, right? She has to be worried about her father now. And how do you feel? Well, it's a pretty disgusting feeling. But maybe if you're one of those optimistic persons, you can say, well, maybe the next guy will understand God and women, right? And so the next guy is, oh no, Oh no, he doesn't understand either one. So let's take a look, a sober look at Samson. So the very beginning, I'm going to call him the self-centered deliverer. The very beginning, he has a miraculous birth. Now, all this does is increase our hopes about him, because people in the Bible who have miraculous births are people like Jesus and John the Baptizer and Isaac and Samuel. That's a pretty select group. And for Samson to be put in there raises our expectations of what he's going to accomplish, only to have them dashed by the reality of his life. But we'll get to that in a second, right? So when he's born, the nurse comes in and says, "Congratulations, you just had a Nazarite," which means God determined he would be one, and that is someone who is especially dedicated to God. He's not going to touch any grapes in his life, because we want to make sure that we're in control at all times. So you can't get drunk or even touch a grape. You're just going to totally stay away from it, so you'll be totally in control. You're not going to cut your hair at all, because when you do, your hair gets long and everyone will see that you are a Nazarite. You're totally unashamed of your dedication to God. And then you're not going to touch any dead things, because death and sin are enemies, and you're supposed to be especially separated from those things. So how does Samson's life demonstrate his Nazarite vow? The answer is he breaks every one of them in spades, right? When you think about in control, there's nobody who is more out of control than Samson is. When you think about unashamed of our dedication to God and his people, no, there's nobody who's more comfortable with Philistines than he is. And touching dead things, well, yeah, that's even the little picture we have there, the jawbone of the donkey, right? And if you don't know the story, you don't know the background, you don't know Deuteronomy, right? You think, oh, what an innovative guy. He grabbed a jawbone of a donkey. Well, no, no, the whole point is he took something he wasn't supposed to touch. And so this would have just totally ruined the whole story, right, for anybody who knows the background, any Jewish person. He killed 1,000 men. That's great. How'd you say he did that? With the jawbone of a donkey. Oh, no. Really? That just ruins everything, right? This is not a example of being clever. This is an example of being clueless. Right? So let me get on to it just really quickly. There's so much good stuff to talk about. I can't talk about everything I want to. So let me just say his view of women. Notice his view of women, and I'm going to go back here to the text in Judges 14, and I just want you to notice very carefully here. Samson went down to Timnah and saw there a young Philistine woman. A couple things I want to say about this. All right. The first is that if you know the geography here, he lives a good 2.5 hours from Timnah. A friend and I had some spare time in Israel one time, and so we decided to take the hike that he did, right? And I was amazed how hard it was, how hot it was, how sweaty it was, and how difficult the whole trek was. And I realized, he didn't just happen to go to Timnah one day. He totally, intentionally, deliberately went there. It took him a lot of effort and a lot of work and a lot of sweat to get to a Philistine city. And when he does, notice what happens. He saw. Now, that's a big deal because the text makes a big deal out of it, because Samson and his eyes are a major theme. He's always seeing things. He goes back to his parents and he says to his parents, "She is right in my eyes." Now, here's the amazing thing. Notice what happens. He sees her. That's all he does, just sees her. The text does not say they met, they talked, they had discussions. They looked at their respective life goals and determined they could do more together for God than they could apart, right? No. He just sees and is like, oh, I like that, right? That's about the level where he is. Not only that, but if you just flip the page a little bit and you realize what happens in that very famous story of the lion and the riddle here, notice carefully the way these words are given. With this riddle that he gives to the Philistines, and of course she doesn't know and they're pressuring her, and so she kind of gets it out of him. She says, "You hate me, you don't really love me, you've given my people a riddle, but you haven't told me the answer." And here's what he says to her. Now, ladies, think about this for a second. You're on your honeymoon and your new husband says this to you. "I haven't even explained it to my father or mother," replied, "so why should I explain it to you?" Do you see a small problem with this? I mean, whatever happened to Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2? For this cause shall a man leave his father and mother and cleave unto his wife, and the two shall become one. He doesn't get that at all. Mom and dad are more important to me than you are, right? And then he goes on, he says, I don't know how this plays back then, but to me it just seems funny. If you hadn't plowed with my heifer, you wouldn't have solved my riddle. Oh, he called me a cow. Oh, that's so sweet. I don't know. The whole thing just seems really base and pretty barbaric to me. And I think that he knows nothing about women. In fact, if you take a look at the women in his life, every woman who comes into his life pays the price. Because he's not the kind of guy you really want to be around, right? And then notice this. His humiliation and vengeance on the Philistines. Now, we've already kind of skipped over the killing 1,000 Philistines with the jawbone of a donkey, right? But again, remember, that's a really oxymoronic thing to do, right? He picks up this thing, which is incredibly, well, I'll just say this jawbone is fairly dead, right? By definition, it's fairly dead. It's an amazing weapon if you want to come up afterwards and grab it and hold on to it and, you know, hit your friend just to feel what it's like. It's an incredible weapon, but what's so most amazing about this, of course, is this, that if I were a Nazirite, I would be in complete and utter defilement right now. Thankfully, we're not in the Old Testament, and thankfully I'm not a Nazirite, so I can touch this without any trouble. But to do this would be to ruin my Nazirite vow, right? And this is just part and parcel of the way he's living, all these inherent contradictions. So his humiliation and vengeance on the Philistines starts in chapter 16. Again, look at the text, and notice the incredibly beautiful way this text is written. This is just a masterpiece. It's literary art. And notice that it says, verse 1, chapter 16, one day Samson went to Gaza. Now, the reason that's genius is because of this. When you take a look at where Gaza is way down here on the coast, just as the Gaza Strip is today, if you're familiar with the geography of Israel. Way down here on the coast, notice it's behind the plain of the Philistines, and Hebron is up here, right? We're going to get to that in a second. But right now, he goes to Gaza. Now, do you realize how hard it is to get from the central spot up here in the hill country, where the Israelites live, to Gaza? I mean, we're way past Timnah now, right? One day went to Gaza. It just says that in such a matter-of-fact way that you realize, whoa, is this just a common occurrence for him? For this judge of Israel to be going all the way to Gaza? Right? And so, as you read that verse, there are a number of things in there that are incredibly wrong, right? One day, Samson went to Gaza, wrong. He went in to spend the night, and where he saw a prostitute. Again, he sees a prostitute, and he spends the night with her, right? And the text just kind of glosses over like, hey, it's not unusual, kind of an everyday occurrence. And you just kind of shake your head and say, what is going on here? This is the very last judge we see. What is wrong with him, right? So he gets up at night. The Philistines decide they're going to kill him. They don't say, we're not going to make a move now, we'll wait till daylight. But he gets up at midnight, and he got up and he took hold of the doors of the city gate together with the two posts and tore them loose, bar and all, lifted them to his shoulders and carried them to the top of the hill that faces Hebron. Now, it's really important to know some geography and some culture here, because recognize that the gates, the city gates, are the weakest spot of the wall. So when they make the gates, they don't make them cheaply or superficially. So when he walks up there, Samson walks up and says, Philistines lock gate. Samson pick up gate. Puts it on his back. I don't know if he was a total brute or what, but he just picks the thing up and then he carries it to Hebron. Now, notice where Hebron is, right? We'll give you a little picture here. Here's Gaza. He grabs the gate, carries it all the way over here up to Hebron, which is 40 miles to the east and 3,300 feet up, right? Now, this is a huge, massive gate. One of the first lessons I learned when I was doing backpacking was the distance you can go is directly proportional or inversely proportional to the amount of weight you have on your back. You got 20 pounds, you can go forever. You got 50 pounds, you're not going so far. Right? My guess is this is a whole lot more than 50 pounds. This is probably like 500 pounds. So the fact that he goes 40 miles east and 3,300 feet up is an absolute flat out, no kidding around, you can't even mess with this miracle. Right? This is something which no one can do just because they work out a little bit. Right? This is a clear miracle. Now, only when you put all that geography and culture together do you then come to the important spiritual question, which is this. If the Spirit of God is there enabling him to do such an incredible supernatural feat of carrying the gate up to Hebron, why wasn't the Spirit of God there to help him say no to the prostitute in the first place? And in fact, therein lies the conundrum of Samson and so many other judges and so many of the people here and so many of us, and that is simply this, that God gives you the choice to make every day. Am I going to use the power or not? And if you look at this and say, that's wrong, God should not have let him use that Spirit, let me just say that God gives you and me the same choice every day. There isn't a single ability, gift, capacity that you have that God didn't give you. And every day, you have a choice to use it for yourself or for him. Every day. And so you don't look at Samson and say, well, how could he do that? Well, just turn and look in the mirror and you find out we do it an awful lot all the time, right? But hopefully as we take a look at him, we see, man, I don't want to do that. God, don't let me do that kind of thing. So he carries this thing up there, and imagine there were an awful lot of guys up at Hebron that probably wanted to trash talk the guys down in Gaza. You know, like, hey, you guys missing a gate? Huh? We got an extra gate. You want it? No, never mind. We'll just build a new one, right? So, of course, what happens next is the whole Delilah affair. And I'm not even going to talk about that. I don't know how anybody can be so stupid, right? As you read through the story, hey, just tie me up with some fresh ropes and I'll be like, and every time she clearly betrays him. Why is he so stupid? Why does he feel like he can play with fire like that? I don't know, but he does. And of course, when they do catch him and cut off his hair, his power leaves him. And so they carry him back to, guess where? Gaza, and have him grind grain. And what do? They poke his eyes out so he can't see. The trouble is he never could really see anyway. Didn't use his eyes for the right things anyway. And so he grinds grain, and then, of course, at the end, he prays this prayer, and the prayer he prays is this. It's right here in chapter 16. You would hope that as he's blind and grinding grain, that he would come to his senses, and that he would say, oh God, this is so wrong, this is so stupid, I realize I've been a horrible judge of Israel. You've given me all these gifts and abilities, and yet I've used them for selfish ends and immoral ends, and my life has been a total waste. But let me finally, God, repent of that and do something for your glory. Give me power to push these pillars apart, right? That's what you would hope, but that isn't what happens. What he does is the best he can come up with is this. Let me with one blow get revenge on the Philistines for my 2 eyes. You see this? So here's where he is. He's saying, I just want to get revenge because of my eyes, and I just want you to realize here that this is the best he can come up with, personal vengeance. I would much rather have a young kid who had a slingshot, who, when he came up to a big bad Philistine, said, who is this that insults the armies of the living God? And is concerned about God's glory instead of his own personal vengeance, right? But we don't have that here. That's coming, but we don't have that yet. And this is the last thing that Samson does. So let's put the judges to bed and let's go on to the end. All right? So the religious and moral disorder, 2 perfect stories. Now, again, said it the first time, I'll say it again. These are not good. They are perfectly bad, like the perfect storm. And I'll just hit the first one really quickly, because it introduces this famous phrase. In fact, if you hear anything about the book of Judges, you probably have heard this. In those days there was no king in Israel, but every man did that which was right in his own eyes. King James language. And I would like to kind of break it down and assert that I think there are 2 parts to this. And the 2 parts are the red one and the blue one. That is, there's no king in Israel, and everybody does what's right in his own eyes. Now my question is there a cause and effect relationship? That is, it's important to figure that out because you don't want to treat a symptom, you want to treat the problem, right? When you go to the doctor, you don't want to just mask the symptoms. Like, if you have something that will cure the disease, do that. And so, which is it here? Is it the fact that there is chaos in blue that causes us not to have a king, or is the fact that we don't have a king the cause that makes there to be a lot of chaos? Well, again, just pay some attention to what the text is trying to say. You'll notice that it says it again in 18:1. In those days there was no king in Israel. In 19:1, there was no king in Israel. And in the very last verse, there was no king in Israel. Every man did what was right in his own eyes. Now, notice I have not doctored this up. I have not edited this. So that you've got this idea there's no king in Israel 4 times, and everybody does what's right in his own eyes only 2 times, right? So right there in the text, the writer is trying to double up the red stuff over the blue, right? So my guess is that the cause, which brings the other effect, the cause is that we don't have a king, right? We don't have a godly man who will stand up and say, enough is enough is enough. We're not going to do this anymore. We don't have that, okay? So that's the big idea of really what we've seen up to this point, and certainly what's going to happen after it as well. So let's get to it then and take a look at the very first story, which is about these major players. Micah, a Levite from Bethlehem, and the tribe of Dan. I'm just going to simplify it here really quickly and say that Dan, the tribe of Dan, was originally given territory in Philistia to settle. They didn't like that because those Philistines were hard. So they decided to head up to the place where no one was, and this is where they settle. And during that time, they come in contact with this guy named Micah and his Levite and his idols. So to start out, we start out with Micah, and we find out in verse number 2 that he's such a loser, he steals money from his mom. Right? The writer just drops us right down in the middle of the story. It says, hey, Mom, you know that money that was stolen from you, about which I heard you utter a curse, I took it. So he steals money from his mom. He confesses because he doesn't want to be cursed. His mom then turns around and says, oh, what can I do for my sweet little thief? Here's what I'll do. I'll make you a nice idol. So she does. Makes him a nice idol. Then he makes other household gods, and then he installs one of his own sons as a household priest. Now, you might look at this and think, well, what's the problem? But if you look at this through a Deuteronomic lens, you realize everything's the problem. You can't do any of this, right? And anybody who's reading through with some sense and who knows the Old Testament says, how can you do this? Right? Do what? Well, this, and this. Everything is wrong, right? And that's where the writer again comes in just beautifully and says, oh, did I forget to mention that in those days there was no king in Israel? And everybody did what was right in his own eyes. You say, man, I guess so. Right? So he goes through and he does some dumb things. I'm not going to talk about all of them, but I just want to highlight 2 statements from Micah that are incredibly condemning. The first one is in verse 13 where he says, now I know the Lord will be prosper me because I have a Levite as a priest. Now again, you need to be a critical reader. I don't mean that you need to be cynical, but you don't want to read that and think, whoa, Micah was telling the truth. I mean, he thought he was, but Micah's just stupid, all right? Just write it down there. It's like Micah saying, because you can't just take a Levite and make him your own priest. That's not the way it's supposed to work. That's not what Deuteronomy says, right? So it's almost like saying, oh, now that I've broken all of God's rules, I know he'll bless me. I mean, an informed reader is just like going, what's going on here? And then, verse 24, after the tribe of Dan steals his idols and steals his priest. It's a really funny story. Because when the tribe of Dan comes, they go and they start to steal the idols. And the priest says, you can't do that. And they say, cover your mouth, be quiet. If you come with us, we will make you the priest of a whole tribe. So it'll be a job promotion. And he says, oh, okay, let me help you get the idols together. And he goes. Everything's so backwards, so backwards. And then he says this, after he's going after the tribe of Dan, he says, look, you take my gods that I made and the priest and you go away. What have I left? And again, I just think that's one of the most empty statements you can ever ask. I mean, at this point, I want to say, I want to shout to Micah and say, how about the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? How about Yahweh? but you get the impression he probably wouldn't hear you anyway. So let's go on to the last section. Now, as you read through this story, it is ugly as ugly can be, but I hope it rang some bells for you. I hope it made some sense. Did you catch what was going on in this story? Particularly in chapter 19. There's a guy who has this concubine, runs away. He goes and he gets her and brings her back home. And they start in Bethlehem. They go north to Jerusalem, which is a pagan city. And they say, it's almost nighttime. Maybe we should just stop here. And the guy says, no, we can't stop in a pagan city. Let's go on to a city of the Israelites, to a godly city. And they go up to Gibeah. Now, when they get to Gibeah, the story starts to look really, really, really similar to another story. You know what it is? There's another story that, if we're to use, a metaphor, is painted in the same colors. In fact, the details are so similar that if you take a careful look at it, you can't miss the fact that Judges chapter 19 looks exactly like what story? It's Sodom and Gomorrah. It's Sodom and Gomorrah all over again to the detail. So God makes it kind of easy for us because that's Genesis 19. So Genesis 19, the guys who come out and they want to rape the man inside, and the guy who is the homeowner says, no, you can't do that. That would be bad, but take my daughter and take his concubine. And so let me just pick up the story so you see, again, I'm not making this up. Pick up the story. And the text says this in chapter 19. The men would not listen to them. Let me put the text up here on the screen. The men would not listen to them. So the man took his concubine and sent her outside to them, and they raped her and abused her throughout the night. Now, just to be really, really clear, in the Hebrew text, it doesn't just say he sent her out, it says he shoved her out the door. Think about that for a little bit. He shoved her out the door. They asked for him. He shoves her out the door. And then the text says, at daybreak, the woman went back to the house where her master was staying, fell down at the door, and lay there until daylight. So she's still alive. When her master got up in the morning and opened the door of his house and stepped out to continue on his way, there lay his concubine fallen in the doorway of the house with her hands on the threshold. He said to her, get up, let's go, but there was no answer. Now, notice the details in the story. If the threshold of the house is right here, right, and he is inside the house and he gets ready to go up on his way and he opens the door, what does he have to do to get out? He has to step like this, right? And he has to actually step over her to get out. It's not like he kneels down on one knee and says, oh, honey, are you okay? Or cup her face in his hands and say, you took what was intended for me, and I was such a coward, I pushed you out. Are you at least all right? Right? None of that. Get up, let's go. Not talking. Let's take her and put her on my donkey. When we get home, I'll say, look what these people did to my property. You notice that the text doesn't give her a name. She has no identity. She's not even a person. She's just a piece of property. He takes her home and is so disgusted by what they did to his property, he cuts her up in 12 pieces and sends her off to 12 tribes of Israel. So they come back and they say, wow, we can't take this. This is really bad. So let's go to war. And the worst part is that the Benjamites, the rest of the tribe around Gibeah, defend them. And so they end up destroying the entire tribe of Benjamin except for 600 guys. And so then they need to find wives for the 600 Benjamite bachelors, because they realize if we don't give them wives, they're going to go extinct. So what should we do? Well, there was one town that didn't go with us named Jabesh Gilead. So let's go down there and kill all the guys and all the moms and all the brothers, and we'll get some women for these Benjamites. So they do that. And they come back with 400 young female orphans from Jabesh Gilead. Again, imagine this, ladies. Imagine. I mean, it's like, isn't this one of your dreams? To have someone come in and slaughter your entire family so you can go and marry some pervert from the tribe of Benjamin. So, well, man, we need 200 more. So there's this festival at Shiloh, and there are another 200 girls, well, lots of girls there. So you 200 guys who didn't get wives, you go up and grab one, and we'll look the other way. So they do that. And that's how the story ends. You look at this and you say, what is wrong with this picture? And the trouble is, you'd just be going forever and ever if you answer that. It's easier to answer this question, what's right? And the answer is nothing. There's not a single decision or motive or thought that is in any sense God-honoring. And so the book finishes, there was no king. So, very quickly, as we move through the stories, look for three things, I said. Is there progress from one story to the next? And I think you have found out that what I told you was true, that what we have done has really gone down the drain. Completely. Male leadership evaporates, and the society pays the price. Number two, how does it make you feel? And I'm just going to tell you how I feel. I feel sick and empty after reading through those stories. How you feel? Number three, how does the role of women relate to the main theme? And I think it's easy to summarize this way. Women especially, I mean everybody does, but women especially suffer the effects of sin when the culture decays. In fact, the nation's relationship with God is accurately measured by the treatment of women. Is it a godly nation? Just take a look and see how they treat their women. And you can gauge their spiritual temperature all the way through the book, from Achsah and Othniel down to this no-name woman piece of property at the end. So, man, I had such high hopes. We had the land, we had the nation, and I thought for sure we were going to get that leader, but after this book is over, all Judges has done is taunted us and said, man, do you realize how blank that box is? And in fact, you learn to put things in proportion here just a little bit too, don't you? Because last time I think I said, man, we're 2/3 of the way there. We got the land, we got the nation. All we need is the leader. And you come to the end of the book and you realize, wait a minute, if you got land and you got nation, but you don't have leader, you don't have anything. The leader is worth about 99%. Because if you have land and nation, but you don't have the leader, they're just starting to look like one of the nations that was there before. And so it's true. There was no king in Israel, and everybody did what was right in his own eyes. And man, is there any hope? Is there any hope at all? I don't know. All we have left to look at is a little love story, and there surely is not much hope there. But let's try. So the two books are so different. One is about corruption in the nation. One is about a personal love story. How in the world are they connected? But of course, if you take a look at the text itself, verse 1 says, in the days when the judges ruled. You see how incredibly important that is. What the writer of Ruth is trying to say is, hey, you know all that stuff you just saw there? This story happened right then. Now, if you come to this book of Ruth with an understanding of Judges, and you read this first statement, in the days when the judges ruled, you don't look at that as though it's some nostalgic time. Oh, think about the good old days, right? You say, oh, dear God, please, not another story from Judges. I can't take it. It's so disgusting. It's so discouraging. God says, no, I want to tell you one more story about the days when the judges ruled. And it looks like this. Naomi is emptied. She lives in Bethlehem, which means house of bread, but there is no bread in the house of bread. There's a famine. So she leaves and goes around the Dead Sea to Moab, and there her husband and her 2 sons die. Now that's a tragedy in any age. But keep putting Judges back in your mind. What's it like then for this woman without any male leadership in her family? It's going to be really a problem, right? And so Ruth shows her loyalty by saying, Ruth comes along even though Oprah stays back home and does weight loss programs and TV talk shows. If you notice that in the text or not. Orpah is her name. which simply makes Ruth look better because Ruth says, no, your people will be my people and your God will be my God. Now, sometimes you hear that at weddings. You don't realize how important it is. Imagine what that was like for Ruth to say that to Naomi here. Your people are going to be my people? Why would any single woman in her right mind want to go to the land of Israel? Unless you had incredible faith in the God of Israel. And so you go, and Ruth and Naomi return, and Naomi says, don't call me Naomi, call me Mara, because the Lord Almighty has made my life very bitter. Mara means bitter, of course. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Now, those words, full and empty, become really, really important. Right? So she says them, and I'm just going to kind of pick up on it. She went away full, but she comes back empty. So the first thing that's going to happen is Ruth and Boaz are going to meet, but before they actually meet, we get to meet Boaz himself. And the text says this, just then Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. The Lord be with you. It's interesting. The harvesters say back, may the Lord bless you, exclamation point. Now, I don't know if any of you here have had a chance to work in a really, 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 really secular job, but I've worked in several construction gangs and warehouses, and it was not uncommon at all to hear God's name used about the boss, but typically pretty cursing sort of a manner. Never heard anybody say, may God's richest blessing fall upon you. Exclamation point. Now, what does that tell you? It tells you this. Everybody's nice to the boss, but you can tell the true character of a person by how they treat the people underneath them. When the workers look at the boss and say, man, may you use your power to bless our lives, may God's richest blessing be upon you, that tells you something about his character. So then he meets Ruth. Now, we're just going to play this out. So, Tori, help me out, okay? She's going to be Ruth here for a second. Now, this is not what you think. In fact, disabuse your mind of all the little romantic notions you used to have and put yourself back in Judges, right? So this is Ruth now, sitting in the field, working, and she sees the boss man. It's my class, I get to be the boss man, okay? She sees Boaz, and he catches her eye, and he starts to walk over to her. Now, stop right here. Stop right here. Read this like a careful interpreter does. Knowing what you know now, what's the only thing going through her head? What's the only thing she can be thinking? What are you thinking?
Something bad's about to happen.
Oh, something incredibly bad is about to happen. It's the only thing, only bad can happen to you right now, right? Because the guy with all the power comes to you. You left your dad, your brothers back there in Moab. You're in this guy's field. He has all the power. You know that because everybody, when he comes in, all the harvesters say hello to him. And so he comes over to you and he looks at you and you're thinking, oh my goodness, my worst nightmare is just about to happen. He's going to come over. He's going to take advantage of me. He's going to abuse me in some way. And what are the very first words out of his mouth? What does he say to her? What are the very first words out of his mouth? He says to Ruth, my daughter. Wow. Tender words, right? This is not some stupid pickup line. This is not some word of abuse. This is like, you know what? I want you to know from the very beginning, I'm going to protect you like a father should protect a daughter. And in fact, what he says to her next just backs that up completely, because you'll notice in the text, he says this. Let me turn to Ruth chapter 2. He says, my daughter, don't go and glean in another field and don't go away from here. Stay here with my servant girls. Watch the field where the men are harvesting and follow along after the girls. I've told the men not to touch you. Does that sound like a realistic story? Absolutely. After you just read through the book of Judges, I know what these guys are like. I told them not even to touch you. You stay here. You're going to be safe. And you follow along with the servant girls. Everybody's going to work. But then notice this, the next verse. And whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled. Now, I don't know if that sounds strange to you, but let me just say this, that in a field like this, the way you get water is not by opening a spigot, right? You have to go to a well and you have to lift the water that's really, really heavy up 40 or 50 feet. And who does it here in Boaz's field? The guys do. Does that mean we're going to let the women off? No, everybody works, right? But we've noticed that physiologically it's like God gave muscles, bigger muscles to guys, and we're going to do the heavy lifting, and you can drink the water which the men have done. Like in this field, everywhere else in Israel, this is turned upside down, and the men use their power to abuse women, but in Boaz's field, it's turned right side up, and you know what? Everybody's doing their work. And when everybody's doing their work as they're supposed to, man, things work so much better. And then he invites her to lunch, and he says this to her. One of my favorite verses, verse 14. At mealtime, Boaz said to her, come over here, have some bread, and dip it in the wine vinegar. And when she sat down with the harvesters, he offered her some roasted grain. She ate all she wanted and had some left over. So it's noontime. You've been working out in the field. How do you start to feel around 11 o'clock when you've been working hard? A little hungry, a little empty, right? And she came and she was filled, right? So she comes empty and she goes away full. You see the words again? And one of my favorite parts, as she got up to glean, Boaz gave orders to his men, even if she gathers among the sheaves, don't embarrass her. Now, the reason that's so powerful is because you got that background of Samson and everybody else in the book of Judges who were just talking like brute beasts. You hadn't plowed with my heifer, you never would have got my riddle. Are they just all a bunch of beasts? And the answer is no. Because this guy says to the men, look, she feels out of place. She's a foreigner here. She's come to our God. I don't want you guys making fun of her or laughing at her or even embarrassing her. He's concerned about her emotional well-being. And he says that. And it's not because he has any romantic interest in her at all. He doesn't. I mean, the text tells us he does not have any romantic interest. He just does it because he's good. He's good to the harvesters. He's good to the males. And he's good to the females. It's not because he's trying to get anything from any of them, but to bless their lives. Because he's good. So she goes home and she says, Mom, you're never going to believe what happened. I met a guy who was kind. I didn't know there were any of them left. And Ruth says, you know what? He's one of our Kinsmen Redeemers. And being from out of town, Ruth doesn't know this. And Ruth says, what's a Kinsman Redeemer? And Naomi says, well, Kinsman Redeemer is a kinsman who is close to us, whose job, when we lose our male protection, is to take us into his family and redeem our lives from oblivion. And he does that. And so what happens is this. Ruth goes to Boaz and says, would you be the Kinsman Redeemer? She goes to him at night so as not to embarrass him. I don't think there's anything crazy going on there because he says, look, everybody knows you are and then he uses the word from Proverbs 31, you're a virtuous woman. You're a woman of noble character. Everybody knows that, right? And she says, would you be the Kinsman Redeemer? Would you take us into your household? Would you marry me and provide for us? Because single women living in Israel are, man, in a tough way. And he says, absolutely. But before you go home, I want you to do this. Take a whole bunch of grain because I don't want you to go back to your mother-in-law empty. Every time she encounters him, she comes empty and she goes away full because he gives to her. He does not take from her. Did you catch that? He does not use her. He does not take from her. He only gives to her because he is good. So Boaz redeems Ruth, and he goes in front of this, it's kind of a funny little story. It seems rather useless. He goes to the city gate where all the business is done, and there's another guy who's a closer kinsman redeemer. He says, do you want to marry her? Because if you want to, you can. You have the first right. And the guy says, no, I don't want to do it because I would have to give away my inheritance. And Boaz says, okay, then I'll do it. Now, why that? Well, because if we were back in Judges and a guy wanted a woman, how would he get her? Certainly not through legal means, right? So in the end, Naomi is filled. Verse 13 says, Naomi has a son. Now, if you're reading this really technically, you might say, well, hold on. Ruth has a son, not Naomi, but Naomi has a grandson to care for her. She's even more desperate than Ruth was because she's older. And so she has someone to care for her, and they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, Jesse the father of David. Now, like good Jewish people, they figure like the ultimate way to end a book is with a genealogy. But it is absolute genius. Because watch this. Watch what happens. As you move through the stories, we said to look for three things. You said, I thought that was just for Judges. No, it's for Ruth too. There's progress from one story to the next. Before we said we went downhill. Now I feel like we're going up. Don't you? I said, how does it make you feel? Before we said sick and empty, and now it's like, well, I'll tell you, I'm feeling pretty healthy and full. Full? Get it? Right. Number three, how does the role of women relate to the main theme? We said this, they suffer the effects of sin, but now you can say in this one, women flourish and help others flourish when men play their roles well. Notice the structure of this book. The very first verse says, when the judges ruled. Right? The very middle verse, and it might be the middle word, I'm not quite sure, but I didn't want to exaggerate, but I know it's absolutely the middle verse, has the words Kinsmen Redeemer in it. And did you note what the very last verse, in fact, what the very last word of the book is? It's David. You see the outline of the book? It starts off in despair. At the absolute middle, we get a hope. And then by the end, we get to David. So that what this book is actually doing is this. We're talking about two different levels here. Number one, Boaz does on a personal level for Ruth what David's going to do on a national level for Israel. And this is how the book speaks about the solution to the period of the judges. It is with a David who is like a Boaz. I don't actually think there's a whole lot of difference in their character. God just gives a bigger platform to David than he does to Boaz. But the kind of integrity and goodness it takes to love Ruth is the same kind it takes to love Israel, and David does that. So let me just talk about real quickly here about what it means to be human. And let me just again theologically define human. To be human is not to be sinful. Right? I know we typically speak in those terms like, well, he's just human, so he's going to fail. No. Jesus is totally human. He's not sinful. Adam and Eve were totally human before they sinned. Right? So that what I want to say is this, that when you're on this top level and you're close to God, you get to experience what it means to be fully human, to experience the being made in God's image. When you get far away from God in sin, you become less than human. When you get autonomous or independent, you don't become more human, you become less human, you become more like a beast. So let me just break these down a little bit and say at the top here, part of what it means to be in God's image is that you're rational. When you get far away from God, you get stupid. You make bad choices. When you're close to God, you are relational because you're made to be a social being. When you get far from God, you become an anti-relational. When you're close to God, you were made to be a physical and sexual being. When you get far away from God, you get involved in death and abuse. I'll talk about that in a second. And when you're close to God, you're intended to be a ruler and to steward things well. And when you get far away from God, you become abusive. And here's what I'm talking about. When you take a look at the period of the Judges, you see that bottom row just explained all over the place, right? I mean, people making irrational choices. Oh yeah, let's just cut her up and send her off the 12 tribes. Oh, let's get the girls from Jabesh Gilead. Oh, hey, if you tie me in fresh ropes, I'll be... Who does that makes those kind of stupid decisions, right? You become anti-relational. If you hadn't plowed with my heifer, you'd never gotten my riddle. All the death and abuse that happens there, and people are abusive rulers. But you take a look at the book of Ruth and notice what happens. In the book of Ruth, people are rational. They make the smartest decision you can ever make is, your God will be my God. The smart decision you can make is, hey, let's do this legally and above board. Let's go to the city gates and make it right. They're relational. Look at how they care for each other. The men and the women care for each other. Physical and sexual. My goodness, what happens at the end of the book? A baby is born. There is new life. I don't remember any babies being born in Judges, just people dying. But there's new life in Ruth. And finally, Boaz and others are good rulers. They steward their lives well. Right? And so what you find here is that when people are following God and honoring God, they're experiencing what it really means to be human in the very best sense of the term. And it's only because there is a leader in the heart of Boaz and in the heart of David. And when Jesus is the center of their lives, then they show it and they give promise that maybe another leader will come, because apart from that, if you've got land, if you've got nation, but you don't have that Messiah, you haven't got anything. So that is the story of Judges and Ruth. Have a good day, everybody. See you later.